Telling stories isn't that hard. It's a skill we practice as soon as we're able to communicate. But if you're trying to tell that story in a script, like a TV pilot, things suddenly start to feel a lot harder. So how do we make telling a story in a TV pilot easier? Hi, I'm Micah Cratty. I'm a WGA screenwriter and the head of writing at Arc Studio, and this is the third lesson in our How to Write a Great TV Pilot course. In our first two lessons, we covered developing a great idea for a TV show and creating compelling characters. In this lesson, we're going to learn some storytelling building blocks that will make coming up with the story for your pilot episode a lot easier. And we're doing this in this lesson because in the next lesson, we're going to use some of those lessons to actually come up with a story for your pilot episode. If you haven't, please like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you don't miss out on the future lessons. Now, come join me as we devour this pizza of knowledge together, brought to you by Arc Studio and your imagination. The first building block you'll need to build the story of your pilot is to actually know what the story is in your pilot. In the first lesson, we developed the idea for your show, and in the second lesson, we created the characters. But what are those characters actually going to be doing in your pilot episode? Now, the main story in your pilot might seem obvious to you, but if it doesn't, we're going to draw on some of those concepts we learned in the first two lessons. In the first lesson, we learned about chronic conflicts and story engines, and in the second lesson, we learned about a fundamental disconnect for your characters. If you haven't watched those lessons yet, I recommend checking them out, but here's a quick refresher on those three concepts. A chronic conflict, or an unresolvable conflict, is the kind of conflict that doesn't just get resolved once and then it's over, like in a movie. It's a conflict that keeps creating new problems, which then keeps creating new stories. For example, in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano is a mob boss who's having panic attacks. That's something that's going to keep causing more problems, and that's going to make more stories. A story engine is an element in your show that's going to keep creating stories. For instance, in Law & Order, there's a new case to solve every week. That's going to create a new story. A fundamental disconnect is the gap between what your character wants and the reality of their world. For example, in Abbott Elementary, Janine is a teacher who wants to do everything she can to help her students learn, but that's really difficult because her school's underfunded and she's inexperienced. That's going to keep creating new problems, which will create new stories for new episodes. You'll probably notice that these three concepts are related, and they are. They're just different ways of looking at it. But tying this back to the question at hand, the story in your pilot episode is an instance of the problems these three things cause. Often it's the first instance of the problem, the thing that starts it off. We call this a premise pilot because you're establishing the premise of the show moving forward. There are also shows that have episodic pilots that feel more like a regular episode, like this could be the third episode or the fourth episode of the show. But generally, even shows like Law & Order that are procedurals will have something to start things off, like someone getting hired, it's the first day on the job. So to recap, the story in your pilot episode is an instance of the kind of stories that your show is going to be telling moving forward. And usually the pilot story includes how this is all getting started. In the next lesson, we're going to go much deeper into this, but this should help get your brain started working. Now, let's learn some more building blocks that will make this story process a lot easier. To build your story, you need to know what stories are made of, and that brings us to beats. Now, in film and TV, the word beat can mean a lot of different things, but in this context, I'm talking about beats as a unit of story. If you added up all the beats, that would be the story in your episode. A beat is like a plot point. A helpful way to think about it is that a beat is when something in your story is changing. Or if you were writing out your story in bullet points, each of those bullet points would be a beat. If you're wondering what the difference is between a beat and a scene, it's that a beat is a section of your story, while a scene is a section of your script. A scene is everything in your script that's happening in one location at one time. Sometimes a beat can last for one scene, but a beat can also last over multiple scenes. For instance, let's say you're writing about a couple that's having an argument. The argument starts in the front yard, it continues as they walk inside the house, and then it concludes when they move into the backyard. Now, that's three different scenes: exterior front yard, interior house, exterior backyard, but it's just one beat that lasts across those three scenes. Together, we'd call those three scenes a sequence. So while a beat may last one scene, it can also take place over multiple scenes, aka a sequence. Which, by the way, if it's easier for you to think about this in terms of sequences instead of beats, that's fine. But I learned about this working on TV shows that talked about beats, so that's what we're going to be using for this lesson. It's really helpful if each of your story beats has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beat starts for a reason, something happens in the middle, and then it ends for a reason. The key phrase there is for a reason. It's not just randomly following your characters around as they go about their lives. It's happening for a reason. In the previous lesson, we talked about how character goals are really helpful for your story long term, but they're also really helpful here at the beat level. Another way to look at this beginning and middle and end concept in beats is through the lens of character goals. The beat starts because your character wants something. It has a middle where they try to get what they want, and it ends because they either succeed or fail in getting what they want, which then leads organically to the next beat. This creates tension, resolution, and change, which is really satisfying for an audience. So beats are the basic unit of your story, and each beat should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But a beat is kind of like a brick. On its own, a brick isn't that useful. It's how you arrange it with other bricks that turns it into a wall or a house. It's the same thing with beats. It's how you arrange your beats with other beats that turns them into a story. So how do you arrange your beats with other beats? With buts and therefores. Don't worry, I'll explain more. A but is a complication in your story. Teddy realized he needed to buy an ingredient to cook dinner, but when he got to the store, he found it was closed. The store being closed is a complication. So a but is a complication, and a therefore is a consequence of that complication. We can see this by continuing our story with Teddy. Teddy realized he needed to buy an ingredient to cook dinner, but when he got to the store, he found it was closed. Therefore, he got a pizza instead. That's a story in 3 beats. Teddy realized he needed the ingredient, he went to the store and saw it was closed, and so then instead he went and got a pizza. 3 beats with a happy ending. It's not the most exciting story in the world, but it is a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It also has a character who wanted something, went after that, and then failed. It's a story with 3 beats, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But if we look at those beats individually, they also each have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But how can that be? Those beats are so simple. Well, let's take a closer look at the first beat. Teddy realized he needed to buy an ingredient to cook dinner. The beat starts with Teddy needing something to cook dinner. It has a middle where he goes to investigate if he has that ingredient, and it ends with him being frustrated when he realizes he can't find it, which then leads to the next beat where he has to go to the store. Again, it's not the most exciting story, but there is a little story arc there. So what you're doing is you're building your big story arc out of these little story arcs. One of the great things about but and therefore is that it makes all the beats in your story necessary. You can't just take one out because then the story would change. A good test to see if you need a beat in your story is to take it out. If your story doesn't change, you probably didn't need that beat. Complications and consequences are also fantastic at helping us develop our characters because how our characters react to complications shows us who they are. For instance, how did Teddy react to the complication of the store being closed? Is he the kind of guy who's going to drive around town to every store and find this ingredient no matter what and never give up? No, he's the kind of character who's going to give up immediately and go buy a pizza. A last great thing about complications and consequences is it helps us find drama in everyday life, just the normal human things that your audience is going to resonate with. Not everything has to be life and death. Now let's look at a counterexample. What would Teddy's story be like without complications and consequences? This is the and then approach. Teddy realized he needed to buy an ingredient to cook dinner, and then he went to the store and bought the ingredient, and then he went home and cooked dinner. That's also 3 beats. Similar things happened, dinner, store, etc. But it's not really a story. It's just sort of a list of events. Nothing interesting happened. There was no twists, no turns, no tension, no drama, and we didn't learn anything about the character. One thing you want for your story is the audience to be asking questions along the way. If they feel compelled to learn the answer to some question, they're going to keep reading the script or watching the show in order to find out what that answer is. Some of those questions might be obvious, like what happens next, or if it's a murder mystery, who's the killer? But there are a lot of other questions the audience may be asking. For instance, why did a character do that surprising thing? What will be the consequences of this risky action? When will that other character learn the horrible truth? Will the protagonist be successful? There's a truism that all stories are mysteries in a way, and I kind of like that. So I think it's really helpful to keep these kinds of questions in mind as you're developing your story. Sometimes a pilot will have more than one story. The main storyline is called the A story, but then there might be a secondary storyline called the B story, and even a third storyline called the C story, aka a runner. The A story is the main story of your episode. It's your protagonist's main story. In a pilot, most of the episode is probably going to be the A story because there's a lot of work you have to do in a pilot to get the story moving, so there's not a lot of room for other stories. In later episodes of the show, sometimes the B and C stories will be bigger parts of it. But your pilot might also have a B story. Oftentimes in a TV show, a B story will follow another character. So your A story will follow your main character, and your B story will follow a secondary character. If there are two main characters in a show, we call that a two-hander, and if there are a lot of main characters, we call that an ensemble. But even in two-handers and ensembles, usually each episode focuses in on one character in particular. It's that character's episode. Whomever that character is, that's your A story. If you're in this situation, you may want to focus in on one of your characters and have them be the focus of your pilot. Sometimes both the A and the B story can be about your main character. For instance, in a detective show, you could have the A story be the detective trying to catch the serial killer, which is what your show is about, and the B story can be an ongoing storyline about their troubles at home, their family issues or something emotional or relational. So in the pilot episode, most of the episode would be the A story, investigating the killer, but then you'd have some scenes with the detective at home, and developing that B story. What's the ongoing emotional story? The C story or runner would be like a minor thing. Oftentimes it's a little funny thing. Pilots don't always have C stories because there's not much room, but it may be something that you have in your later episodes. Spend some time thinking about these building blocks and how they apply to your TV pilot. It's going to make things a lot easier in the next lesson when we start actually building out the story for your pilot episode. Until then, be kind to yourselves and happy writing.